There we go. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Larson, and I'm the curator of Ancient Glass here at the Corning Museum of Glass. And I'm also the curator of the special exhibition Dig Deeper, Discovering an Ancient Glass Workshop, which is opening in a little over 3 weeks. And it's going to be amazing. So hope you all are able to come back and see that when that show opens. So I'm going to begin our program tonight with a land acknowledgement. The Corning Museum of Glass is located on the unceded, seized territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, of which the Onondaga, the Seneca Nation, and the Gayagahono, the Cayuga Nation, are a part. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy precedes the establishment of the museum, New York State, and the United States of America. The museum acknowledges the oppressive history inflicted upon and the continued dispossession of the Haudenosaunee people. We honor their ongoing connection to these lands and waters. And we ask all who hear this acknowledgement to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that connect us all. This is a living land acknowledgement, and we will continue to revise and strengthen it as we continue to learn as an institution and in collaboration with others. So, joining me live this evening from Wales, who's staying up quite late, is John Swogger. John is an archaeological illustrator who's best known for his work in the medium of archaeological comics. And together we are co-authors and collaborators on the publication accompanying the Dig Deeper exhibition, this 36-page comic book. Yay! Thank you, thank you. All right, so John is going to tell you a little bit more about his career and kind of how he got into illustrating comics for archaeologists in a little bit. But I wanted to start tonight by answering the question that everybody asks me when they hear that we did a comic book for this exhibition, which is, why did you decide to do a comic book and how did you get John involved? And the answer to those are actually the same thing, because I decided to do a comic because I found out about John. So I was starting to work on the idea for this exhibition that was focused on a glass workshop, which was excavated by a team from the Corning Museum of Glass and the University of Missouri back in the 1960s. It was excavated in the 1960s. I wasn't thinking about it in the 1960s. So when I arrived at Corning, I discovered that we had a large amount of material from this site, and some of it was really quite interesting and spectacular. And I knew about it because Jalame, the name of this site, is really important to glass specialists. So coming in as a glass expert in ancient glass, I found out we had this material, and it was really exciting to be able to kind of look at it and learn from it hands-on, and I thought, what a great thing to try to share with our visitors, and worked on this exhibition for it. But even though it was pretty exciting to me as an archaeologist, I recognized that it's a little fragmentary. It needs a lot of kind of robust interpretation. It's not what a lot of museum audiences are used to seeing. So we would need to kind of develop some really powerful graphics and story and methods to help people understand this material and what they were looking at in order to pull off this exhibition. And at the same time, I was thinking about what a publication to accompany the exhibition might look like. The museum, if you aren't aware, has a wonderful line of publications accompanying our special exhibitions, beautiful scholarly catalogs, but it just didn't feel like the right fit for this kind of exhibition. So as I was thinking about all these things, John was working on a guest post for a blog that I follow. And when it was posted and I read it, I felt I'd solved my problems because the way he talked about his work to illustrate the past, to bring in concepts of storytelling, to appeal to different audiences, but still really grounded in academic scholarly content, really reflected my own thinking about the way I was approaching this work. So I reached out to him with this idea of writing a comic book about ancient glass and was just delighted when he said yes. So this was back in November 2018. A few things have changed in the world since November 2018. But John and I have been working together on this project for over 4.5 years, and I'm just delighted that the day has come that it is here with us in print and we can share it with all of you. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the thought behind that work and what we've learned along the way. As I mentioned, John's going to start by talking about how he got into illustrating archaeology through comics. So that's the first part of our program. And then he and I will have a conversation about some of the things that we thought about in the process, ask each other some questions. And then at the end of the program, there'll be opportunity for those of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining us online to ask your own questions, and of course, followed by the book signing at the end for anybody who'd like to partake in that. So with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's attending, both in person and online. Can I have the next slide, please, Scott? So understanding where I come from as an archaeological illustrator, you really have to understand that I began my career as a very traditional archaeological illustrator. I worked on research projects, both in the UK and around the world, doing the kind of illustrations that you would all be familiar with, you know, if you read any kind of scholarly publication, site report, and so on. Next slide, please, Scott. And this is the kind of illustration work that I was doing. I did these illustrations for academic books, for journal articles, site reports, specialist and technical publications, very much using the standard professional archaeological illustration techniques and conventions that had been around for decades, centuries. Next slide, please. Even when I started to do reconstructions, first buildings and so on for specialist publications, and then paintings for more popular consumption, I still used the same conventions, the same approaches, the same techniques that would be familiar to anybody who's ever seen any visualization of archaeology. So that what happened? Why did I stop doing, or why did I move from these kind of illustrations to, next slide, please, these kind of illustrations? So that story begins back in 2005. Next slide, please, Scott. I was working at the site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey. Now, this is a very, very large Neolithic settlement, about 9,000 years old. Very, very complex architecture, complex stratigraphy, amazing archaeology, wall painting, sculpture, multiple burials, a 2,000-year history of occupation. So for us archaeologists, absolutely fascinating, but very, very difficult to explain. Next slide, please. And we did have to explain the site. In particular, there were audiences that we had that had no background in archaeology at all, no understanding of archaeology whatsoever. And among those were the local village children who came to us for an open day every year. And one year, the director, Ian Hodder, sitting there with the balloons and the children, said, is there a different way? Is there some way that we can communicate what we're doing here at the site to the kids who come along on this open day? Is there something that we can do that's maybe going to get the story across to them a bit better? Next slide, please. So together with my colleagues, Sonia Atelier and Burju Tung, we created a series of comics. These were very, very simple, just double-sided, printed out with a printer, that we could hand out to the kids when they came for the open days. And when I made these, I wasn't really thinking about comics. I was just thinking about, you know, solving this request from the director. Is there some way of getting information across? And so we produced them. And in a sense, I didn't even really know what I had made. But as I saw the kids reading the comics, you know, it was clear that they really enjoyed them. But what was really surprising was that the adults were reading them as well. And it was that observation that really sparked off a series of questions for me. What was it? What was it about these comics that was communicating? Or how did they work? And was there something particular about them that lent itself to archaeology? Next slide, please. So we have a tradition in English-speaking Western countries of categorizing comics really more as entertainment than literature. Superhero and adventure comics, you know, they're seen as light, as trivial, even childish. They're aimed at young readers, is what most people would think. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Scott. But what's really interesting is that comics actually employ a really sophisticated communications toolset in order to get this content across. So they meld together image and text in a really interesting way. They use sequences to create narrative and to set pace. These stories are always very human-centric. They feature people as central characters. They use first-person speech and dialogue to make the relationships between characters explicit, to make the relationship between characters and their situations and surroundings explicit. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry. And as a consequence, comics have evolved to the point where they're able to take on board really complex and sometimes difficult stories. And they do this by using a very sophisticated and nuanced visual narrative. Art Spiegelman's Mouse is perhaps the classic example of this, a graphic novel based on the experiences of the author's father as a Jew in Nazi Germany, but told through the disturbing visual metaphor of mice and cats. And it was works like this, not specifically Mouse, but works like this that made me think, is there a sort of a less entertainment-based, more literary-based approach in comics that might help tell complex, unfamiliar, even specialist stories about archaeology? Next slide, please. Well, the answer, of course, is yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here giving this talk. So 2 years after I made that first comic at Chadalhuic, I began experimenting using comics to tell a whole range of different archaeological stories, from field excavation to science, from post-colonial politics to the role of women in archaeological STEM subjects, from the distribution of post holes and burials to radiocarbon dating and archaeometallurgical analysis. And I did so kind of as an experiment to see what it was that comics could do for archaeology. And to see how they worked, I want to look at the difference between these comics and some of the traditional type of illustrations that I was doing earlier in my career. Next slide, please. So here's a comparison. Artifact illustrations, like the ones I used to do on the left, and the comic that I started doing on the right. So the artifact illustrations, I think, really embody three particular problems that traditional archaeological visualization has. The first is, as you can see, these images, the pictures of the objects, they stand alone. They're presented without any kind of context. You really don't get a sense of where the objects were found or any relation to any other aspect of archaeological practice or science or knowledge unless you dive into the text and search through it for references to that information. But the comic, by contrast, shows you the objects that are found in an archaeological excavation in the context in which they are found. So you can see immediately the relationships between the artifacts and any associated features. This is made explicit. Secondly, in those archaeological illustrations on the left, you can tell that there's some kind of visual shorthand being employed here that only archaeologists really fully understand. If you're not an archaeologist and you're looking at these images, why are they rotated in this way? Why not another way? Does the filled in black bits, do those mean something different? What do all the numbers mean? What do they refer to? So you really have to be an archaeologist to understand or to get the information out of these images. But by contrast, the comic on the right, it shows everything in a more or less real-world point of view. If there are diagrammatic elements, they're clearly identified as such. They're colored differently. They're represented differently. And so as a consequence, I think viewers can understand and get information out of a comic much more easily than they can from the illustrations on the left. And the third really obvious thing about the artifact illustration is that there are no archaeologists there. There's no sense of who created this archaeological knowledge. And yet over in the comic, we have people all the time. We have people excavating, we have people recording, and down at the bottom, we even have an anthropologist talking about their research. And he does so in first-person speech, and he's identified by name. Next slide, please. So this is what comics can do in archaeology. They can do three really important things. The first is that they can visualize the context of archaeological finds, archaeological research, archaeological material and thought. Secondly, they can structure unfamiliar and complex elements to do with archaeology so that it's easier for people to access that information. And thirdly, they humanize and consequently ground archaeological practice in the real world. Next slide, please. Importantly then, they reduce the need, or indeed remove it entirely, this need for prior knowledge. So you don't have to be an archaeologist in order to understand an archaeological comic, whereas you do have to be an archaeologist in order to understand artifact illustrations. Next slide, please. So having kind of thought my way through these three things and figured out what it was that comics were doing, I then spent the rest of the 10 years making comics. I went all around the world following different projects, excavation projects, research projects, museum projects. And so these will give you some examples of the kind of comics that I made and the kind of things that I found I was able to illustrate much more effectively, I thought, in the comics. These are a couple of pages from a comic about the archaeology of an island in the Pacific, in Micronesia, called Yap. And you can see here that I'm using diagrams, I'm using views of the excavation process, I'm using images of pottery, and I've got yet another archaeologist in there at the bottom right, explaining things directly to the reader. Next slide, please. Here I have two comics from a series of newspaper comic strips that I did in this country, in the UK, about the archaeology, history, and heritage of a small market town called Oswestry. And each week I tackled a different subject. It's 4 panels in a newspaper, but I was able to break down often quite complex and kind of multi-period stories in such a way that they were more accessible. And you can see in the second of those comics, the one about Oswestry Castle, it shows it being built, it shows it being knocked down, and then it shows the archaeologists excavating, and it finishes actually with an invitation from the director to come up and see what we're doing. So again, you see how it's not just about the information and making the information accessible, it's this personalizing, this kind of grounding of the work that's being done in the present day. Next slide, please. I also tackled archaeological science. I did a couple of comics about radiocarbon dating and metallurgical analysis, and I found the comics a really useful way of breaking down the very complex and specialist information that you get in archaeological sciences and putting it before the readers in a way that made it easy for them to understand not just the science, but the archaeology and the connections between the two. Next slide, please. These were really interesting comics. These were reconstructing the hand processes behind making 19th century ceramics. And this was a real opportunity to break stuff down diagrammatically, but also to include people to show exactly what went on in making any particular kind of piece of ceramicware. Next slide, please. I also did more comics about archaeological sites, and these narratives were interesting because they kind of went back and forward through time, from the prehistoric past to the present day, but also into the historic past, to show how archaeologists discovered and excavated these sites and how their interpretations of those sites had changed. Next slide, please. Back in the Pacific, I finished a comic just before the pandemic showing how communities on some of these islands are facing the challenges presented by climate change, the damage that rising sea levels and increasingly violent storms are having on traditional archaeological sites, villages, and that kind of thing. This comic was a really nice way of demonstrating how things like science and politics, religion and community engagement are all interwoven at these sites in the effort to protect them. Next slide, please. And then in Bolivia, very recently, I've used comics in partnership with local communities to show how archaeological evidence from sites, pre-contact sites nearby, how they can be used to reconstruct pre-Columbian lifeways and make the connections to the people, the native peoples that live still in those areas. And this comic, or this slide, also shows another important thing about comics is that the language is changeable. And so in this instance, the language, instead of being English, was Aymara, the local language spoken in these communities. Next slide, please. And I think you can see from that last comic that there's inevitably a political dimension to some of this work. And this is very explicit in the comics that I've been doing in partnership with Native American communities in the United States, telling the stories of repatriations from museums under NAGPRA. This is the law that allows Native communities and tribes to request the return of ancestral remains and sacred objects from the museum collection back to the tribes. I mean, obviously, these are hugely important events and hugely important stories for the tribes, but they're also extremely important for museums who are building very new relationships with some of these communities. Next slide, please. And what's nice about that project is that it's now become a focus. We're now partnering with the National Museum of the American Indian, which is part of the Smithsonian, to use it as a way to mentor Native writers and artists so that they're able to tell these stories themselves. Next slide, please. So that's been something of a whirlwind tour, but I hope it gives you some sense of how these projects really highlight all the potential and possibilities that using comics in archaeology offers. Not just to explore new ways to communicate visually, to make archaeological stories engaging, and not just explaining complicated science or specialist information in a way which is both clear and accessible, but making sure that those stories remain personal and relevant, that they include the researchers, the voices of the researchers, but also the voices of the communities, sometimes for whom the past is more than just a field of academic inquiry. Next slide, please. Which I think brings us nicely to the subject of the Corning comic, in which all of these things are brought together. So Kate, back to you.
Thanks. Those of you in the virtual land will now see that I have this lovely backdrop. Well, I guess you in person can see it too, which is one of the images from the book, of course, kind of the site of Jalame. So that was really fabulous, John. And I was like jotting down notes and things to talk about. But one of the things we definitely want to talk about was something you talked about early on, which was even you realized early on how the audiences for comics are not just kids. I think that's something that I also encountered as I was telling people, hey, we're doing a comic book. They were like, oh, it's a book for kids. I was like, well, yes, but it's more than that. And I actually think that a lot of this information is something that specialists would really benefit from as well, to have these visual interpretations. So how is that kind of like, how have your thinking about audiences and of these things kind of evolved over the years?
It definitely has evolved. When I was first asked to make those comics in Turkey, Ian was very clear, these are for the children. And so that's what was in my mind, that these were for the children. And then I saw the adults reading them and realized, oh, well, adults can read comics too. But in fact, as I started to work on the comics when I went out to the Caribbean, it was me. I was the audience. I was working on a site that I really don't know anything about Amerindian archaeology. Well, I certainly didn't when I first went out there. And so I was learning about these sites. I was learning about the archaeology. I was learning about the context on the islands, all of which was new to me. And so in a way, the comics that I was making were like a journal of how I was learning about the site and the archaeology and the context. And that model, I think, is exactly what I take to every single other project that I've worked on. So, I mean, obviously, I have some archaeological background. I have kind of a generalist archaeological knowledge of most things that come my way. But ceramics, I mean, 19th century pottery, I don't know a huge amount about that. Glass, I knew absolutely nothing about it. And so the comic was almost like my way of understanding the subject. And I think that's really useful because it means that you're never, as the writer or the artist, being too kind of didactic and too kind of talking to people as if they should know more about this. You're really kind of going along with them on this journey from knowing nothing to, by the end of it, hopefully knowing a fair amount more.
Well, and I think it's like almost like writing a museum label where
Yes.
you have to be really conscious about your words because there's not a lot of space. So you have to be really restricted. Think about your vocabulary really deliberately. Like, who are you talking to? Explain your terms.
Mhm.
In some ways, it does. We talked about this as we worked through the Dig Deeper comic, that you can say more with fewer words because you've got those really robust illustrations to back
Right,
it up.
right.
And so if you've balanced your text and your image correctly, people can get information without having to read a single word. Or they can, like you can kind of choose how to engage in this material in a really, I think, powerful way.
Yes, and that's something I think that real comics people would definitely agree with, that it's getting that balance between image and word that's so crucial. I think as archaeologists and academics, the tendency is to go for the written word, to go for the text, to say, well, I need to, this is my one opportunity to explain this stuff, so I'm going to cram this comic as full of words as I possibly can. But the truth is that a lot of the weight of those words can be carried by the images, and you can see this in the panels in the Corning comic, because there are some instances where you said, oh, we need to have this, we need to have that, we need to have the next thing, and it's in there, but it's in the background, or it's in the stuff that people are holding, or it's in the place, the location. I actually have a colleague who said that a comic is like an exhibition, and so you have this series of panels, like you have a series of rooms or a series of exhibition spaces within an exhibition. And so the parallel between a museum and a comic, I think, or museum gallery and a comic is absolutely there.
I also I kind of talked a little bit about the beginning about how we didn't do a catalog for this exhibition. And one of the things that I sort of insisted on that was at the very end, that we would do this kind of scrapbook style visual catalog. So yeah, you've got your copy.
I got my copies today. Thank you
Yeah,
very much. Yes.
I have copies today. Thank you, Suzanne and Keith. That I really wanted to make that connection, I think, a little bit more explicit about that the things that you were seeing in the comic were really grounded in the physical objects, that you weren't just and how where that level of interpretation came in terms of what's sort of a fragment and what are you kind of building out around it. So
Right. It's one of the reasons why I don't use, I generally tend not to use made up characters in the comics. I want it to be the real archaeologists who really look like that, who really wear red t-shirts and have dirt all over their faces. I don't want it to be, there's already so much that's made up about archaeology out there in the world. I don't want to be contributing to that. And it makes it difficult for the reader to judge if they're looking at a, Indiana Jones and a real piece of glass, well, which is fake and which is real? So as far as possible, the stories that I create are entirely based in the real stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think what's really powerful about what you're doing and, this kind of work is doing things that creating a visual world, an immersive world around the ancient past, around what archaeology is, that does appeal to broader audiences, that doesn't sort of lean toward these sort of more sensationalist Indiana Jones, Lara Croft, that are so common in the popular media about kind of archaeology as this sort of white person, Western person going out and taking things, I think, and really being much more explicit about what archaeology is and how archaeologists work.
Yeah, and that comes through. I mean, that actually is the basis for the reason for using comics with, say, the NAGPRA stories, because it's very important there to be clear about who is speaking and who is taking responsibility for things. So when you have archaeologists saying, no, this is not related to you, this should not leave the museum, you want those words to be associated with a particular person who actually said them. That is absolutely crucial in those stories, but it's no less crucial, I think, in like the Jalame story, because if you have people whose careers are founded on doing this kind of work and who've made really important contributions to the field, well, you want to know who those people are. And I always find it frustrating, even now, reading academic books, and somebody will quote somebody else, like Smith, 1984. Well, who was this person? I don't know anything about them. I'm not an expert in this field, and this name, this voice, this supposed expert is just being thrown at me. And I it's very difficult to find out who that person is sometimes.
One of the other things we've talked about is how we can use comics to really bring fresh energy into academic work. And I think you made this point really nicely earlier on, that archaeologists talk about, yeah, like this. I mean, this is such a lively illustration. This is actually not in the book. This is something we're using in the exhibition.
Mm.
But like building out, like that you did for us, kind of special for the exhibition, but creating this world around the objects. You know, when I started at Corning several years ago now, and I would talk to people who didn't have a background in the ancient world, and they would just say, and they would say, you know, I love the ancient glass. It's so beautiful. It's so amazing to think this material survived so long, but I really struggle to see the people in it. I don't know what the stories are. I don't know where the people are. And that has really stuck with me and driven a lot of what I think about as and I think this image is a great illustration of how you can build that, like comics can kind of create that world by creating these details that bring it to life in a way and show it in use, and that I don't need to spend 150 words describing utilitarian functional wear used in taverns and domestic settings, right? This like very like academic knowledge, you know, you can kind of tell it all in a picture. So and I think your point about the archaeological illustration, you know, archaeologists talk so much about context, like context. And then in our forms of publication, we just take pieces out of context and like focus on them. That's what we do in exhibitions. So bringing the context back in.
Yeah, and I think there's something really nice about comics too. This is that I've come to appreciate. There's a stylization to it that doesn't become artificial. You know, it still has, or it depends what style you use as an artist, but it can still have a sense of it being very real, even though it is very stylized. And this illustration is perhaps a good example of that. I mean, it's entirely artificial. It's entirely constructed. I wanted to be able to show as many things as possible in a small amount of space as possible. And, you know, all the illustration tricks are there. You put some people closer to the point of view, you put some people further away, but it's remarkable how much stuff is in there. And yet somehow it doesn't feel quite as staged as it would be if it was done in pencils or watercolors or oils and so on. They're like the staginess of it might feel a little bit more labored. And I sometimes feel like comics as a medium gives you almost like a get out of jail free card in a way, that you can, because people expect the medium to be stylized. And so you can use that to your advantage and create scenes like this. But at the same time, as you say, there's a huge amount of detail in there that's archaeologically justified, that's, you know, explaining how things are used and setting a scene and creating a world that otherwise you just wouldn't have.
So you, okay, let's talk about the community. Let's turn off this, can we turn off this slide for right now? Because I want to ask John about a book that you recently collaborated on, which is the Comics and Archaeology book, and how our comics, like this is a whole field that's really emerging right now. And I think I mean, obviously when we started working together, I wasn't aware of this as a movement, but can you give us a little bit of context about how you see comics being used in the field and what the kind of like intellectual underpinnings of this work are and that publication?
You weren't aware of it as a thing because it wasn't a thing yet. I mean, this is so emergent. It's, you know, this book is really the first time that I've seen those two words together in anything that I haven't written. That's not entirely true, but it's pretty close to being true. So yeah, so this book it came out of a conference organized by colleagues in London. It was really nothing to do with me. I was quite surprised to get an invitation to it. And I was actually asked not to contribute to the conference, but to come along and do a comics and archaeology workshop, which on the one hand is like, well, you know, I'd like to contribute to the conference, but on the other hand was really rewarding because it said that people were interested in the making of comics. So this wasn't like a comic scholars, let's study comics. It was a whole bunch of people involved in various aspects of archaeology, from fieldwork to classics to teaching, who wanted to know about the making of comics, the doing of comics. And so myself and a friend, a colleague who also makes archaeological comics called Hannah Sackett, we went down and we did a workshop. And the conference was it was small, but it was very, very successful. And as a consequence, the organizers went to Palgrave Macmillan and said, we'd really like to publish the contributions, the papers from this conference, and we'd like to make it part of a line of studies in comics, because the Palgrave had this line. And so they agreed. And so the comics and archaeology book is like it's about a genre that is not, is so new it doesn't even exist yet. And that's really, really exciting, because all of the chapters in that book were people saying, this is how I think we can use comics in the field that I'm particularly interested in. It wasn't people saying, oh, well, in this Tintin book or in that Marvel book, there was somebody who was an archaeologist, which is where comics and archaeology have usually intersected before that. So this is very practical, very kind of hands-on, very drawing boardy, and that's great. And I don't know what's going to happen next.
That's the best kind of projects.
It really is. Yeah.
So you talked about it in your presentation, and it's interesting the way that I think archaeology and museums are sort of in alignment in thinking more about community-centered work in what we do, and telling stories that members of communities, especially who haven't had a lot of voice in their own representations in museums and academic scholarship, are represented. So this was something that I think really evolved for me as we worked over the comic over the years, and we always wanted to kind of center the people, but it became more and more important to me to think about all the people involved, the broader community, not just the sort of key archaeologists whose names are on the publication. So I think now if we can pull up that slide we were looking at a minute ago with the community, and I also think a nice thing about comics is you can represent diversity of people in different ways. So these are some images from the book that kind of show various community members and kind of giving them physical presence in a space.
That physical presence, I think, is really important. And this is what I was trying to get at with the reference to Smith 1984, is that, yes, okay, that, any archaeological story involves hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who all play a tiny part. But most of those people never, ever get seen. They never get beyond even the Smith bit, if they even get that far. And there is something really nice about being able to tell the introduction to an archaeological story, how this site was found, by reference to the people who farmed or lived or worked or were connected to that land. And even though you can't follow everybody's story all the time, it simply isn't possible, including them as actual people, including them as presences within the narrative is hugely important. Yes. And I don't know of any other way to do it in publication that isn't just, a series of snapshots, kind of like what we've got in the image on the right-hand side there, this series of snapshots, which was useful for the introduction page to the comic, but which is really about as far as it goes in most publications, which is, I think, a real shame.
Yeah, we also talked a lot about representation and how we were depicting people, which is a challenging topic. And I remember showing to one of my colleagues here, like some of the early work we were doing to make sure that they were satisfied with the way we were representing people. And do you feel like that's something, because of your work with communities, you've gained some adeptness at? Or there's also, we asked, like, late ad about physical ability in our the Dig Deep comic.
If I have any adeptness in it, yes, it's definitely because I've learned more and I've been taught more about representation as a consequence of doing stories with communities. And my very earliest introduction to that, which was again a Chadlehic story, is we had a visiting archaeologist came with his 6 or 7 year old son who was kind of given to me to look after because I was drawing things, and that was more interesting than anything else that was going on site. And the kid was looking at the drawings I was doing, and he said, "Where are all the children?" And it suddenly struck me, we were excavating dozens of infant and child burials at this site, and I had not drawn a single child in any of the reconstructions. And it never occurred to me that I was in any way biased towards, kind of 20, 30 something adults. But of course I was. And it was just a very early kind of wake up call to how easy it is to make your representations of the past, or even representations of the present, very much just you wearing different clothes. You know what I mean? It's just projecting yourself and your biases and your positionality into that work. And so, yes, from then on, I became much more aware of how I was not including certain kinds of people, and trying very hard to do so. And including physical ability in that is really interesting, because there are, of course, all sorts of representations of different kinds of physicality in the ancient, the records of the ancient world, and yet somehow those people just don't make it into the reconstruction artwork a lot of the time. So I did try as far as possible to include people in the comic who would be representative of the range and diversity of people at the time.
So let's talk a little bit about glass.
Yeah.
So you'd never worked on glass before, which as you said, I think turned out to be a strength in the way you approach it, because you approached it like a reader would, right? Not knowing about it and kind of what would you want to learn. And when we started working together, we had great hopes that we could bring you to Corning and give you the whole CMOC experience to kind of see it in person and see the dynamics, and
which I still would love to do at some point. Yes.
We're going to make it happen.
Yeah.
So how did you kind of go about immersing yourself in glass in order to make this comic?
To make a general point, this is actually the first project I've worked on where I have had no experience whatsoever of the subject matter. Most of the other work that I do, I either go to the place or I meet people and see how it's done. When I did the Middleport Pottery Works, I went up to the Middleport Pottery Factory and was there for a couple of weeks, and I got clay on my hands and I talked with the people who were applying the transfers and so on. And so when I drew it, I knew what I was drawing because I had seen it done and people had talked me through it. And this was entirely remote. We worked on this all the way through the pandemic, and it was completely and utterly remote. So I was entirely dependent on video. I was entirely dependent on watching and rewatching over and over again what other people were doing. And there's that curious flattening effect of video that actually makes understanding what people are doing in 3D quite difficult if you're then trying to reproduce it in another medium. And so some of my early illustrations, I clearly had no idea of the scale of things, of the size of things, of the plasticity of glass, for example. It never occurred to me that, it sounds stupid, but glass drips and drops when it gets molten. Well, of course it does, but I was treating it like it was a vessel. Like, when it's molten on the end of a blowpipe, I conceived of it as somehow more solid than perhaps it really is. Because it was only later on that I realized that everybody keeps twirling those pipes, because if you don't, it just falls off. It clearly would just fall off. But it was stuff like that, which, would come to you in seconds if you were actually watching glass being blown, or if you had any experience of it, which took me much, much longer to get to grips with. And I still feel in a way that the comic is not, I think I would have drawn it slightly differently had I had that hands-on or, very close experience of glassworking, which I will get at some point. I'm promised.
I guess we have to do part 2 then now.
Yes. But it's interesting, I think, too, from the point of view of any informational comics work, is that the illustrations that go into them, because you are parsing out what's being done and you're trying to explain it to people in the best way possible. If you don't know that subject, or if you don't have any experience of that subject, it can be very difficult to do. And this raises, I think, an issue about the sort of the practicalities involved in some of these projects. If I had to do a comic about going to the moon in a spaceship, that would be a very difficult one to do, because they're not going to train me up as an astronaut in order to get the feel of what it's like to wear a spacesuit and all that kind of thing. So you have to use your imagination, but it can only take you so far, I suspect.
I do think when it seemed to coalesce was when we did our wood-fired furnace experiments here.
Yes.
Like when we
Yes.
did those, and I could start sending you photos of that in action.
Yeah.
So this is a little exhibition plugged and opening plug too. So we'll have that furnace back up and running this summer to kind of see it process in action. But when I could send you those little videos and those photos of that, I noticed it seemed like it gelled a little bit more clearly.
Yes. And actually what was interesting,
bringing it to life. Yep.
And what was interesting too is that you sent me images, I think almost right the way through the construction process, and then the first sort of the first few times that it was being used, and then people got used to it. And it was interesting to watch them, the glassblowers, I mean, getting used to the furnace, because you then said, oh, don't use those images don't use those videos, use these later ones. And it was clear that, but it was useful too, because it meant that I was learning through other people learning and then passing it on as well. So it actually worked out very well.
Yeah, another way that you have inspired us here at the museum is with the Jeep icon. So at the beginning, and this was something you and I had talked about, like early on. We were talking through the comic and the narrative and everything, and you said, like, we need this like iconic moment to start the book. This like sense of like adventure and exploration, and these two archaeologists, it's Gladys Weinberg and Paul Perot, in this Jeep, driving around Israel looking for a site of an ancient glass workshop. And it's so evocative. And this Jeep has become this symbol for the exhibition. And in fact, I don't think I've told you this, that we actually brought in a Jeep in the museum to like start the exhibition experience in our admission lobby. That's going to have this great comic background, like, so it's actually like recreating the scene from the comic here, and we've made a glass Jeep, like we're doing. So this kind of storytelling moment has really launched 1,000 other ideas and really gotten people excited about it. So yeah, so that's ways that like I guess life follows art.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
All right. I'd like to turn it to audience questions now. If there are questions from our in-person or virtual audiences. Yeah. If you want to go to the microphone, or if I can say it aloud, mostly for John because he can't hear here.
Yeah, John, this is for you. I wanted to go back to Ankara, and I was wondering, you made a comic book for the kids, and about this dig of a Hittite fabulous site. How much did the kids know? Were they getting taught in school about about the site and the civilization?
I think the answer is kind of yes and no. It was the site Çatalhöyük is very well known in Turkey, and it's kind of like Stonehenge. It has that national myth making kind of quality to it. So I think as a word, the site name Çatalhöyük was part of kind of that history that you get as a young kid. And at the same time, the children who were living nearby, they're adult members of their family, their uncles, aunts, mothers, fathers, and so on, were working with us at, doing the digging and the manual labor on site, but also working in the labs as well. And so they had kind of a confusing two-strand knowledge of the site. The first was it was this big name, and they're very important to Turkish history. And the second one was, well, it's a place where uncle and aunt go and work every summer. But apart from that, I don't really know what's going on. And we did, I think, and Son, I'd have to talk this over with Sonia to see if my memory is correct. But we did vaguely have this idea that if the comics were successful and we had time and we had funding and all the rest of it, that it would be nice to do something bigger and more involved and, you know, about Çatalhöyük in its general context and something for the schools. But it just never happened. I mean, we just simply weren't set up for that. It was a research excavation. We just couldn't take on board that kind of public outreach publication project, which is a shame. But if anybody wants to do it, then I'd fully advise. But no, we didn't go any further with that, and so I don't really know at the end of the day what the kids did with what we told them and taught them. But it has to be said that I do know that those comics were still being kept by the kids 6 or 7 years after they got them. I had a friend who went to one of the houses and saw that the comics were pinned up on the wall in one of the rooms. So they were keeping them, and I'm hoping that they were learning from them.
This is a little bit of an extension of that question for you, John. There's a question on the online audience for a little bit more about community engagement and asking about how you do work with Native communities in your research and work, like kind of what that looks like.
It's different from community to community. So we're contacted by a representative of the community, usually the tribal historic preservation officer, though not always. And they come to us with a story of a repatriation that they think is interesting or significant in some way. And the NAGPRA comic series is about trying to explain how the law works and its impact on the various communities and people that get involved in the process. So although there are lots of stories of repatriations out there, we specifically look for those stories which are going to explain some peculiarity of the law or some difficulty or some particular way of working that evolved between museums and communities. And so we kind of try and figure out how these stories can best explain those larger concepts, and then go back and talk with the community, and they will nominate members to speak with us because of their involvement, because of their knowledge, because of the nature of what is being returned, and so on. And so that is always different from community to community, and that then shapes the project. So, you know, some people want to talk a lot and they want to do it very conversationally, and they want to meet once a month and chit chat, and it takes you 5 years, and it's great because you really get to know the people. And some people just want to give you a list of facts on a piece of paper, and that's that. So there's a lot of variety, and then the output is very different as well. Sometimes the stories are, the community would like everybody to hear this story, and so it goes out very widely. And sometimes those stories remain within the community. We create comics that don't go beyond the members of the tribe. And again, that's entirely, that's dictated, as it were, by the nature of the project, by the nature of the return, by the nature of the community people involved. So it's very, very different. And I think one of the challenges we're having at the moment is trying to present the NAGPRA comic series as a sort of consistent approach, even though it varies from project to project quite dramatically.
Thanks. Another question, and actually this is something that I'm interested in as well, because people have been asking me and I don't have the answer, and I would like to. Can you talk a little bit about your process of actually creating the illustrations? Like, what do you use?
Oh, I just wave a magic wand and it all happens. Yeah.
Hand-drawn digitally, like I'll tell us
so it's not to cut across that, but the conversation is really the important thing. You know, the over and above any process that I use, any technology or any whatever, it's really the conversation that's important, because the conversation then defines the writing, and the writing gives you the story, and it's the story that you're illustrating. So the biggest tool that I use is you know, this and that, listening to what people say and talking with them. But I know what the questioner is asking. They're asking, you know, what tools do I use? And I drew entirely real world analog pen and ink for years and years, and was very, very happy with it. I experimented with 3D stuff and vector illustration and so on, but it never really took. I never really took to it until 2019. I got my first iPad with the Apple Pencil, and the reason I really took to this was because it was exactly like drawing on paper, drawing in real life, but that was all I needed. I didn't need a drawing board. I didn't need a huge filing cabinet and several rooms to store all the bits of paper in and so on. And that has really freed me up to be able to take the comics making out into the field. And when I worked in the Pacific, I was drawing the comics in the jungle, in the heat, in the humidity, in the rain, in the mud, along with everybody who was doing the real work, the coring and the excavation. And that was a real revelation. It meant that I could document and record as someone in the field, as I had been used to doing as a field archaeologist, but making comics instead of taking notes or drawing plans and sections and that kind of thing. So the iPad and the pencil have proven to be remarkably robust. Actually, I was not expecting them to survive, but this is the same iPad I've had since 2019. Although not the same cover. The cover got very trashed. This is a nice new cover, but it's a remarkably robust tool. I use a software package called Clip Studio, simply because it was specifically designed for making comics, and so therefore I think the way that it does pencils and pens and so on is really nice. And then I draw each panel, often each panel or each group of panels individually, and then take them into InDesign, which is industry standard, I think, for publication. And it means that I can share that InDesign file with whoever then is going to print or edit the comic. There are other ways of doing it that are equally, convenient. But because I work with so many different kinds of clients, different kinds of institutions, InDesign is really something that everybody at least can get access to, if not use. So it makes it easier to share the final product and for it to be printed and so on. So that's my process.
I've been looking at the questions online. Are there any other in-person questions? Yeah, please.
Hi, John. I'm Carol
Hi.
White, the president
Oh,
of the
hello, Carol. Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you virtually.
I recognize your face.
Hide my hair, probably. That's what.
Yeah.
First, I want to say how honored I am to be included in the book in illustration form, because normally it's just my words that show up, just like you were commenting upon, words and a name. Mm-hmm. But I really want to express my gratitude to you and to Kate for the work that you have done to create this really incredible product. When Kate came to me, so many years ago now, and said, I want to do a comic book. I said, okay, who's the audience? Thinking children, and we had a conversation about it, but I was really happy to be able to say, yeah, let's do it, because this is a great way to approach this project. So gratitude to Kate for all of her insight and interest in pursuing this, and your incredible work within the volume. Hearing about what it took to create this is just mind-boggling, how much you have to go back and forth instead of just sitting in front of your computer screen and editing words. So thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Carolyn. I should say thank you for believing in the project when it was this sort of like out of the box question So thank you.
Yeah. Well, and I'd like to take this opportunity just to thank you, Kate, because one of the really important parts of this kind of working is knowing that you can work with the person who's, the expert on the other side of the fence there, and having a good creative collaborative partner is absolutely important. And it just wouldn't work if that didn't work. So thank you.
Yeah, well, same. We kind of undertook this not quite knowing how it would go.
No,
so
no.
I think it's a product that we're both really pleased with. So that feels kind of like a good note to end it on. But I'm really again, really grateful to all of you for sharing this with us this evening. There's going to be a lot more Dig Deeper to come. There are a few folks in the question, kind of asking about the exhibition and the content of that. So don't worry, there will be more. We'll have the online seminar in October that Corning sponsors. There's information about that already online. Our 61st annual seminar on glass on Dig Deeper, on much more about the actual exhibition and content for it as well. Ways we use community engagement in that. So, and the exhibition itself opening in 3 weeks. And we do have copies of the comic available, I believe priced at $9.99. So I think that's one of the other really exciting things about this publication, is that it's really accessible in terms of cost to our audiences. So I'll be signing copies. Those in the virtual audience can, Mariana dropped it into the chat. Please order, enjoy. John, thanks again for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Everybody else who's overseas, I know we've got other overseas folks, so we'll let you all go to bed. And yeah, have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.